Identifying at-risk employees using AI in HR. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Steve Beauchamp, CEO at Paylocity. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, what does Paylocity do?
So Paylocity offers payroll and human capital management software to mid and large businesses, mostly in the mid space. And that includes everything from payroll to benefits to tracking time to all the talent management products like recruiting and onboarding and performance management. So it's a full suite of HR capabilities.
What is it about the dawning of a new year that makes employees relentless and HR managers worried?
I think one of the challenges, HR has traditionally had a lot of back office type functions where they have manual processes. They get a lot of questions from HR. What's on my W-2? I've got to get my W-2 because I want to file my taxes. It has to be right. And the HR departments usually have a lot of work at the end of the year to make sure that all of that happens and they can accommodate the employee request. And so, they often look to providers like us to be able to automate that experience and empower the employees to get that information all on their own.
How can artificial intelligence help human resources and professionals identify the employees who might be looking or might be flight risk and seeking new employment?
Yeah, I think if you look at this problem traditionally, HR runs a whole bunch of reports at the end of the month. They dump them into spreadsheets. They try to analyze those reports, and they look at turnover trends. They look at different data elements in isolation, and then try to figure out what might be correlated to something else. And then they're trying to going back to the managers and saying, hey, how is Steve doing? It looks like we're worried about him. His performance review is really strong. We don't want to lose him. And that's a pretty inefficient process. And so if you think of the technology like artificial intelligence, we have a ton of data in our platform. So, great examples would be, we know what your commute time is to work, we know what your job is, and we know when you had your last raise, and we know your performance reviews, and we know how many jobs that you had with us. And so we know what jobs are going to be kind of in demand. And so when you start to drive all of this data that we naturally collect as we try to automate all of these things for the HR department, we can develop machine learning algorithms that can predict based off the history. So we have millions of employees on our platform. So we can run the history with the algorithm and see what type of prediction rate we can come up with based off those data elements, and then be able to predict to an employer, here's the 10 or 15 or 20 people that we think you need to worry about the most.
What about in recruiting? How does artificial intelligence help and aid in that process?
So you do capture a fair amount of data about a candidate who ultimately may become an employee, and you can also look potentially at which candidates have the skill sets and the backgrounds that you might be looking for, and then what's the success rate of those people. And so you can certainly capture, oh, here's the performance data for these types of individuals. I look back at what they had on their resumes or their candidate data or questions I might ask them in the recruiting process, and I can actually start to increase that correlation between, employee who's a candidate that actually would be a great fit with the employer. I think that's a newer use case that you're starting to see really increase within the HR space. You do see a lot of retention risk algorithms, and now you're starting to see that same thing start to happen in terms of candidate selection.
All right. How does artificial intelligence allow HR teams to re-engage employees and maybe even create better employee-to-employee connections?
That's a great question. I think that's a really burgeoning area. So if you think about HR systems, they traditionally were more about automation. It was less about engaging employees in different ways. But the reality is a lot of the features that have been added to an HCM platform are actually peer-to-peer and employee-to-employee and very engagement-oriented. So several examples would include peer-to-peer recognition, where you've got badges and you can recognize employees for different behaviors. Modernizing the performance management process so that you're tracking activity throughout the year and not waiting for that annual review at the end of the year. And we've also introduced a product like we call it Community, and Community actually allows you to post and make groups and announcements and really start to share information across the organization. We've also got a product called Surveys, and so when you think of the data that you get from that, you might be able to take that flight risk concept and move it way earlier in that employee life cycle, because you're not necessarily measuring flight risk at that point. You're measuring engagement with the company. And in many ways, an employee gets disengaged, dissatisfied. They might be dissatisfied with their manager or with the company as a whole. And then that compounds, and eventually they look for a different job. So the earlier that you can get into that cycle and help identify when somebody's dissatisfied rather than actively looking, the more you can impact retention.
So let's talk about the HR job. I mean, how is artificial intelligence potentially morphing or assisting the human resource manager?
Yeah, I think it's going to impact it in a couple ways. You're already seeing the ability to save them time in terms of the analytics that they naturally have to do as part of their job. And so every HR department has to produce a whole bunch of reports. They have to drive some insights out of that, and they've got to share it across the organization. And so rather than doing that manual analytics that you go through, if you can use artificial intelligence to do the analytics for you and surface it to you in real time, you can now, as an HR department, spend time on initiatives and actions rather than analysis. And because there's so many different data points and people will use the application differently over time, the continuous nature of improvement built into an algorithm is really important. It makes it more effective over time. And so I think we're going to see more and more use cases develop where it will not only save HR time, but it'll actually drive real business results in terms of the actions they can take from that.
Something I keep hearing from you over and over again is data, data, data. It's all about the data. How do
Yeah.
you build the data sets for AI for HR? It sounds like you build them maybe from the aggregate in your customer base.
Yeah, so we do. So I think the first thing I would say is you've got to build really interesting use cases into your platform where people are incentivized to use it. And they're incentivized to use it because it's engaging employees across the platform or it's automating, processes. And so the more you do that and the more utilization that you get on the platform, then the more data that gets created. Surveys is a great example because if we can get customers across our platform to survey every new hire and they survey every terminated employee, we can then aggregate the data across more than 20,000 customers and really come to some really interesting conclusions. But if we only have a couple customers who are doing that, then the data set is just so much smaller. And so it starts with creating products that are super easy to use and getting utilization. Once you do that, we do aggregate the data across the 20,000 customers. We do it in an anonymized fashion. So we're definitely not sharing any confidential information with any other customer. But it allows us to say, we've got customers who are doing this with our platform and they're getting good response from their employees. You might want to consider doing something like that that's specific to your company. And so you can almost imagine a recommendation engine type concept, leveraging the data that's really sourced across the 20,000 plus customers.
Steve Beauchamp, CEO at Paylocity. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to find out more about the software that you provide or the advice that you're offering to HR, how can they do that?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is probably to look me up on LinkedIn. Just type in my name on LinkedIn with Paylocity. You'll be able to shoot me a message that way. Obviously, paylocity.com is our website, so you could hit me up that way as well. So,
thanks again, Steve. And if you guys
thank
want
you
to
very
find
much.
more of, and if you guys want to find any more of my interviews, you could do that right here or go to tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.